Okay, let's dive in. When you hear Afghanistan, um, recent headlines probably dominate, right? Conflict, complexity.
Yeah, uncertainty. It's easy to just see the present.
Exactly. But the material you've shared with us, it paints this much, much vaster picture. It shows today's story is really just the latest chapter in, well, millennia defined by one thing: constant movement.
Constant movement is a good way to put it. You've got invasions, trade routes, migrating peoples, shifting ideas.
All flowing through this land whose, like, geography itself seems to have made it an unavoidable crossroads, since ancient times.
Absolutely. So today we're taking that deep dive into this incredibly rich, layered history. Afghanistan, often called the heart of Central Asia, the crossroads of ancient civilizations.
And to do that, we're relying completely on your source material, this collection of articles, research notes. Specifically, there's a historical account tracing Afghanistan's journey over millennia.
Right. And our mission here is pretty simple. We're acting as your guides, basically pulling out the most important insights from these sources.
We want to help you understand the major forces, the big events that shaped this unique land and its people. Sort of give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about its deep past, and importantly, how those echoes still resonate today.
So where better to start than the land itself? Geography.
Make sense? Our source material puts it front and center: Afghanistan's position. Landlocked, bordered by 6 countries, Pakistan, Iran, China included. Covers a huge area, and it's at a really high average elevation.
Yeah, the source notes it's actually the second highest landlocked country globally after Bhutan. But beyond the stats, the dominant feature, well, it's got to be the Hindu Kush Mountains, right? Rugged.
And the source paints a vivid picture: snow-covered peaks, raging rivers cutting deep gorges, not much vegetation, and this extreme climate: severe winters, then summer dust storms. Sounds formidable.
It is, and that's absolutely key. That geography, on the one hand, created isolation. It helped preserve distinct local cultures, identities. But at the same time, it forced the country into this incredibly strategic position, a bridge, really, between the Middle East and Central Asia.
Linking the Turkestani and Iranian plateaus to the Indo-Gangetic Plain and the Himalayas.
Exactly. So it became this magnet for anyone moving across that part of the world, whether it was for trade or conquest.
It's a place with no sea access, yet the sources mention it's rich in its own natural resources.
Right.
And it's surrounded by regions known for massive mineral and hydrocarbon wealth. It's this geographic paradox, isn't it? Isolated, yet central; rugged, yet resource-rich. Seems fundamental right from the get-go.
Absolutely fundamental. And this position, influenced by Persian, Turkestani, Indian cultures, different climates, it meant Afghanistan became the birthplace, or the seat, of numerous empires over millennia, punctuated, of course, by periodic invasions.
The sources also trace this back, way back, to ancient tribal origins. It talks about early settlers, Bactrians, Ghaznanians, and it even links some modern Pashtun tribes like the Tocharian Brahmins, possibly back to early inhabitants maybe arriving from Greece after Alexander.
Right, and the source connects this to the prehistoric period, suggesting native tribes spoke Iranian and Indo-Aryan languages, forming the basis for current ethnicities. It really emphasizes that because of the geography, these ethnicities, languages, cultures were distinct very, very early on.
But even with that distinctness, the source points to some pretty sophisticated early developments. It mentions the Herd Kabuli district as the homeland of Daraya tribes who founded the powerful Achaemenian dynasty thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and it highlights advanced construction dams, tunnels, canals that sound surprisingly modern for that era.
And the Kabul Valley itself, described as one of the richest agricultural sites known back then. Kabul City, built near ancient centers, was clearly a significant place, visited by envoys from big empires.
Achaemenid, Greek.
And later, a real focal point for conflict between Persia, India, Greece. The source even notes these famous monuments like ancient paintings, the Buddha statues, that incredibly survived right up until the late 20th century.
Amazing survival.
So the first big takeaway from these sources seems to be how Afghanistan's geography created this fundamental tension. Isolation, fostering unique identities, but combined with this strategic location that just made it an unavoidable crossroads, layering cultures, peoples, conflicts from the very beginning.
And that layering just continues, doesn't it?
Right.
With the sweep of ancient empires. Your source describes Afghanistan as the cradle of several ancient civilizations, seat of kingdoms like the Kushan, Bactrian, Zoroastrian, Greek, Ashoka's Buddhist empire, Sasanian, later Islamic ones.
Wow, it sounds like a real melting pot, or maybe more like layers of different influences. The source specifically points to bulk, ancient Parthiana as the birthplace of the prophet Zoroaster.
And the archaeological evidence cited in the source really backs this up. Excavations showing Greco-Macedonian rule, these amazing Buddhist sites like Hada, Kotal, showing that rich Gandhara artistic influence.
Right.
These monuments, the source argues, they testify to a kind of national unity, a creative genius despite all the differences, an enduring spirit that's often overshadowed by conflict and, frankly, neglect today.
The source also really hammers this idea of East-West exchange.
Yeah.
It notes cities like Herat, showing 500 years of continuous habitation under all sorts of different rulers: Greek, Islamic, Mongol, Safavid.
Which suggests, doesn't it, that ideas and creations brought in by outsiders were often picked up, furthered, evolved by local scholars.
It raises that interesting question: how does a place absorb so many external influences but still maintain its own distinct contributions, turning borrowed ideas into something new?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Speaking of those external influences, the Achaemenid Empire, the source says, just saw this land as the eastern part of their territory, a natural extension. And then, when Alexander the Great arrived, he paid special attention, saw it as critical, the boundary of, like, Mesopotamian civilization.
He was clearly impressed. The source quotes him admiring the fertile plains, noting the region's wealth: gold in Turkestan, oxide mines in Bactria.
And the sources trace connections from that early Bactrian activity to later developments. Greek civilization influencing Buddhist art, but filtered through Persian styles.
Right, and later Zoroastrian Sassanid influences too. It describes these Afghan and Iranian tribes alongside light-skinned mountain races waging these huge wars across the region throughout history.
But despite those tensions, the source argues it'd be wrong to assume the Achaemenids just ignored these wild and brave Afghans within their empire.
Yeah, probably not.
Okay, so a major shift, according to the source, comes with the Maurya Empire, founded by Chandragupta, conquering Afghanistan between 317 and 321 BC. This is presented as the first successful establishment of a, quote, national territorial state that actually included Afghanistan.
Right. The Maurya Empire rose in India, but the source emphasizes it was profoundly shaped by prior imperial Persian rule. That Persian period, the source says, it internationalized trade, activated the metallurgical industry, and affected agricultural development. It even prompted migrations to Bactria.
The invasion itself, this account says, happened fast, done in 4 years.
Yeah, and the source describes this period as seeing a big transition from tribal rule based on, birthright primogeniture to a more centralized kingship. And it also saw the founding of Buddhist traditions, the Dhamma, in the region. The source uses this specific term, horticulturism, to describe how the state treated its citizens, suggests a focus on farming, settled life, regardless of ethnic background.
Okay, so after the Maurya, the sources bring in the Kushan Empire, 2nd century. Describes the Yuezhi, these Indo-European nomads, kind of like the earlier Scythians pushing the Greeks out of Bactria.
Right. And the source notes the Kushan's initial religion was pretty diverse before they converted to Buddhism. It has these great details, Yuezhi nomads using gold coins, imitating Alexander, even paying homage to the goddess of Athens. Shows that absorption of foreign ideas again.
The Kushans expanded massively, even into Western India around 50 AD, and the source makes this pretty bold claim. During the Kushan period, Bactria was the artistic center of the world, a blend of Hellenistic, Persian, Central Asian, North Indian art.
Yeah, it pictures the city with extensive walls, brick buildings, suggests it was a major place. This was an era of huge prosperity, trade connecting East and West. Gandhara Buddhism flourished, influencing places like Kashmir.
Wow.
And the source gives these fascinating glimpses of daily life from ancient relics. Musicians, dancers, singers, even sellers of perfumed oils, vaudeville actors. Sounds like a truly vibrant, dynamic society.
It really does. And then, another huge transformative force arrives, the Islamic conquest. The source notes Islam's rapid spread in the 7th century. Muslim forces moving beyond Arabia into Persia and then towards the eastern frontier bulk, Herat.
Right. The source describes those early military campaigns as quite belligerent, but it's careful to add a nuance. Islam also spread through preaching by traders and missionaries.
Okay.
And this, the source argues, helped it spread rapidly despite all the political upheaval. It led to a new linguistic and cultural unity emerging in the region, separate from Iran.
So not just military force, cultural and social factors were just as vital in that huge shift.
Exactly. And this brings us to a period where local dynasties start to rise again. After centuries under these huge empires, the source notes the return of prosperity under the Kushans, then shifts east Afghanistan to the Indian Guptas. west to Persian influence.
Before the whole region comes under Islamic sway. First Umayyad, then Abbasid.
Right. Then, late 8th century, a Turkic general founds a dynasty ruling Central Asia for 2 centuries.
Which sets the stage for the Ghaznavids.
Correct. Their territory, the source notes, roughly matched modern Afghanistan, though they eventually lost their Indian lands and declined. What's interesting is the sources detail about towns like Ghazni, where Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Islam coexisted then.
Really?
Coexisting.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
And the Ghaznavids actively supported Persian literature. It wasn't a simple, clean break with the past.
Then a new power pops up in the west central area of the Ghurids. The source suggests they were maybe trying to forge a distinct Afghan-speaking identity.
But just as these regional powers are getting established, boom, a cataclysmic force arrives, the Mongol invasion.
Genghis Khan united the tribes in 1186, swept through around 1220. The source mentions this led to the end of local dynasties like the Khwarezmian.
And the source includes some really striking and brutal details from this time. Hindus fleeing, leaders losing their countries, the terrible fate of captured people, children, women, the elderly taken off to be sold. Grim stuff. There are also these incredibly vivid, almost mythical descriptions of Genghis Khan himself. In the source, his title, Coronation, being called Warlord of the West, even challenging 52 princes from India and Oman.
Yeah, it's quite dramatic, and there's a remarkable battle detail. Timuri's forces initially beaten by 40 Siamese war elephants.
No way.
But they won the next round, entered Delhi, razed the palace. It just brings home the scale, the unexpected twists of these conflicts.
And this kicked off a period of Mongol dominance that the source says lasted roughly 3 centuries.
Leading eventually to the Timurid Empire, the source really highlights Shah Rukh ruling from Herat in the 15th century, described by Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, as the greatest king known in history.
High praise.
Definitely. Shah Rukh presided over this major cultural flourishing, encouraged building, reconstruction mosques, libraries, palaces, gardens. His rule, influenced by Persian tradition, led to what the source called a long-lasting bloom of art and civility known as the Timurid Renaissance. Active support for literature, especially Persian poetry.
But after Shah Rukh, Timurid power faded.
Yeah, it declined. The region saw the rise of the Lotus, the Iranian Safavids. The source notes the area got divided into smaller states again, kind of following an older tradition.
And the source mentions Afghans getting light firearms around this time, describes horseback pursuits, cruel treatment of cities, noting similarities to earlier conquerors, suggests those cycles of violence kept repeating, even as rulers changed. It also briefly mentions Babur being in Kabul before he headed south.
Right. And the source offers an interesting psychological observation on Babur, suggests his ancestry Tamerlane and Genghis Khan combined with his, quote, contemporary moral sense might explain why you find hints of regret in his journals about some of this stuff.
Interesting. And Babur is hugely significant because he then founded the great Mughal Empire in India in 1526, coming from Turkestan.
Yeah, the source details his long struggle, fought for 23 years before finally getting control of the 6 main kingdoms of Afghanistan: Kabul, Ghazni, Kandahar, Herat, Balkh, Badakhshan.
Basically ending the Afghan dynasty there and starting Mughal rule.
Pretty much. The source then traces the Mughal succession Humayun, his temporary loss and recovery, then the famous Akbar, emperor at just 14.
Right.
Akbar rapidly expanded the empire, conquered huge territories. The source even includes a slightly scandalous detail about Nur Jahan Begum supposedly arranging Jahangir's murder in Kabul.
Juicy. And his successor, Shah Jahan, noted for using imperial wealth on magnificent buildings, like his grandfather, Akbar.
So what you see through this whole period, Ghaznavids to Mughals, is this land constantly central to major imperial power struggles, sometimes controlling vast areas, sometimes being controlled, but always this key strategic spot where cultures and empires collided, and sometimes, like the Timurid era, producing these amazing periods of flourishing.
Okay, that brings us closer to modern times, with the rise of a more distinct Afghan entity, the Durrani Empire, flourishing from 1747 under Ahmad Shah Durrani, a Pushtun chief. This period, the source says, is seen as a golden age in Afghan history.
Yeah, the source includes some really colorful, maybe slightly legendary details. Kabul as a center of learning, poets thriving, Sufis doing miracles, even cows seen giving milk of a golden hue. Clearly a time looked back on with reverence.
The source notes the empire initially covered modern Afghanistan and had unusually well-defined borders for the time.
And it gives this vivid image of Afghans then, Skilled horseback riders navigating borderlands, seeming to be living in a country of their own choosing and being at home everywhere, captures that sense of independence, mobility.
But this golden age didn't last. The source says British meddling, internal fragmentation, led to its disintegration by the 19th century.
Right. Political growth then happened more in regions outside the old Durrani core, and the formal setup of Afghanistan with today's borders came later. The source also mentions religious shifts, the Sufi cult waning, the Salafi movement rising, and attempts to suppress them sparking revolt.
And this period of fragmentation lines up with increasing British intervention, doesn't it? The source is clear. Afghanistan's strategic spot wasn't just about ancient trade anymore. The British saw it as a crucial obstacle to their power in India.
Exactly. The British concern, often called the Great Game, was mostly fear of Russia threatening India. But the source offers a counterpoint, stating there's no evidence that Russia had any aggressive designs on Afghanistan in the 19th century.
Interesting.
Despite that, the source says British policymakers started planning ways to control Afghanistan from the late 1850s anyway.
Which led to the First Anglo-Afghan War. The British backed Shah Shuja initially, but policy changed. An insurrection broke out, and the British expedition under General Elphinstone ended disastrously.
Yeah, the source describes a horrific massacre in 1842. An entire force of 16,000 men wiped out, just one survivor reached India. This event, the source argues, it evaporated any British idea of direct control. They shifted back to just informal influence.
But things flared up again. Dost Muhammad Khan returned, allied with the Sikhs, started getting arms from Russia, which alarmed the British.
Setting the stage for the Second Anglo-Afghan War in 1878. The source details the British demanding an envoy at Dost's court, sending a big army, talks failing. The envoy eventually brought in by force.
And the source says this escalated. A British demand for arbitrary annexation of territory.
Which was refused, prompting the British to try and humiliate the Dost. The source reflects on these British calamities, the difficulty of understanding motives, noting British leaders seemed to believe success would make nations harmless. And it offers that fascinating perspective again, suggesting the Russian advance, like the British one, was forced upon her by the act of others, and both sides claim they were just trying to inculcate peace. The source ends this part with a really poignant line about Afghanistan's hard fate.
It's a powerful point from the source, how external powers, driven by their own fears and needs, kept seeing Afghanistan as a strategic piece on a board, contributing to such a long, difficult history.
Moving into the 20th century and beyond, the source notes how hard it is to predict Afghanistan's future. It describes the people as a brave and independent race, daring and ferocious, highlights the strong nomadic element, lists various tribes, Pashtun, Tajiks, Hazari, though some descriptions feel a bit fragmented or dated now.
It also acknowledges internal challenges mentioned, political turmoil, tyranny, banditry, suggesting internal dynamics were often just as complex, just as harsh as the external pressures.
And then came that pivotal event, the Soviet invasion in late 1979. The source marks this as the start of a decade-long war, a massive revolt against communist rule.
The context, as the source explains it, was the pro-Soviet party's reform program in '78, applied with extraordinary venality and coercion, it says, which really angered Afghan society.
Yeah, that triggered a violent insurrection, notably led by former party members like Hekmatyar and Rabbani, who became Islamist figures. The source states clearly the Soviet invasion itself in December '79 was driven by their fear of an American-backed coup.
And here's the crucial point from the source, that Soviet invasion transformed the existing fight into a major struggle for national liberation. It galvanized support for the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, and fueled intense hostility towards Soviet communism across the Muslim world.
The Mujahideen quickly became known as freedom fighters, and the source links this to a growing international jihad, noting Osama bin Laden setting up a logistics base in Pakistan shortly after the invasion for guerrilla hiring activity.
International support flowed in, the source details. Money, weapons from Muslim nations channeled through a CIA covert program. Stingers are mentioned specifically, million-dollar contracts for assassination, really changing the Mujahideen's abilities.
But the source doesn't paint a simple picture. It also details the challenges. Anti-Soviet feeling waned eventually. Xenophobia grew as more Arab fighters came in. The opposition was initially poorly organized.
Right.
It points to problems like a corrupt clandestine economy, an inept CIA causing inefficiencies, infighting among Afghan leaders, like pro-royalists rejecting broader coalitions, keeping things fractured.
But despite all that, The source notes that by late '82, the Mujahideen had become a serious force under increasingly shrewd leaders focused on Afghan sovereignty.
And this struggle, the environment it created, eventually gave rise to the Taliban. The source explains Taliban means students, founded in '94, mainly drawing from madrasas in Pakistan and getting support from Pakistani institutions.
Described fundamentally as a Pashtun movement, rooted in those southern tribal areas. The source notes militant Islam in Pashto really grew during the Soviet War, especially there.
Right. The source discusses the values the Taliban asserted. Earnest Islamic values, pan-Islam, gender separation. Now, here's a point where the source presents something that seems, well, contradictory. It claims the Taliban supported women's education and employment as early as '88, '89.
Really? That early?
Yet it also states their aggressive pursuit of gender separation and opposition to women's education and employment since late 1995. The source itself holds both these points. It highlights the complexity, maybe the shifting nature of the movement, or just the difficulties in historical accounts.
Okay, that's confusing. But important to note, the source says both.
It is. Anyway, the Taliban rapidly captured the Pashto heartland, then northern states. Helped by the chaos of the civil war after the Soviets left, traditional Pashtun tribal dynamics, and what the source calls its visceral brutality.
Which brings us to the U.S.-led invasion after September 11, 2001. The source states the U.S. demanded the Taliban hand over a key figure, understood from context to be bin Laden. They refused. President Bush declared war.
According to the source, U.S.-led forces started bombing October 7, 2001. Ground invasion just 8 days later.
Described as a blitzkrieg compared to earlier invasions. Massive aerial bombardment cities, other targets. The source even mentions schools believed to be training pilots. The opposing forces quickly lost the air war.
Yeah, the source notes they faced overwhelming odds. Inferior weapons, collapsing morale, resorting to desperate tactics. Morale just broke in most places, leading to surrender without a fight.
And by early December 2001, the source says the Taliban had effectively lost control due to the air war. Retreated from cities, the capital headed south.
A provisional government was quickly set up in Kabul. Operation Enduring Freedom had that dual aim. Target al-Qaeda. Improve conditions for Afghans.
The Bonn Conference in December 2001, transitional government under Karzai, UN, U.S., described in the source as a moment of hope, opportunity, and uncertainty.
The U.S. proposed a two-stage process. 6-month transitional government to reopen schools, create institutions, draft a constitution, hold elections, with the idea of an ethnically balanced government.
Fast forward to the most recent events covered in your material. It notes the Taliban's return in September 2021, the fall of Kabul. The source captures that, resulting confusion, anxiety for many, while others hoped it meant an end to war and poverty.
Yeah, a real mix of reactions. The source wraps up looking at challenges and opportunities now, mentions threats of more conflict, potential long-term persecution for opponents. It frames the last 2 decades as just unprecedented Soviet occupation, Mujahideen victories, civil war, Taliban rule, post-Taliban era, the Islamist authoritarian republicocracy, Ghani's flight, just one thing after another. And the source emphasizes assessing the chances for socio-political, economic development against all these complex vulnerabilities, social, political, economic, geographical, historical, highlighting that ongoing influence of history, like an invisible hand alongside the very visible grip of recent conflict and terror.
Beyond all that conflict and control, your source material also spends time on Afghanistan's enduring culture. It calls Afghanistan very fortunate for its mix of natural beauty, diverse peoples, languages, and historical monuments. A unique combo.
It speaks to the beauty of the mountains, dawn, sunset, captured in literature, mythology, stuff that still fascinates people.
The source includes a really striking claim, describing the Afghan people as far superior in race, manners, character, and language than any of its neighbors.
Whoa!
Yeah, while also noting the distinct peoples and tribes in specific areas who somehow preserve their ways against countless foreign ways. It's a statement that really speaks to a strong sense of internal identity and resilience described in the material.
Interesting claim. The source also goes into the role of women in Afghan society, highlights their crucial roles over centuries, providing food, managing homes, even participating in government sometimes.
But it acknowledges the history also includes women being victims of violence, forced marriage. And the source points out that due to wars, extremist ideologies, women's political status really declined from the 20th century until the Taliban were ousted in 2001.
Right. The post-2001 era is framed as an opportunity for women to actively redefine their roles as vital breadwinners, supporters. The source stresses, excluding women denies over half of the population an equal and basic right of participation. Obvious, but needs saying.
It even mentions an emerging development, an Afghan men's rights movement, recognizing that the country can't progress without women's participation. Contrasting this with the historical lack of legal equality, the low social status, that incredibly high illiteracy rate for women historically, over 80%. It's a complex picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Challenge and potential change.
Very complex. And the source briefly touches again on international relations, specifically that difficult history with Britain, noting the complexity and that idea we mentioned, both British and Russian interventions, may be driven by circumstance, not initial hostile design towards India.
So looking back across this incredibly long, turbulent history revealed in your sources, Afghanistan constantly at this global crossroads, shaped by wave after wave of empires, cultures.
Yeah, we've traced cycles of conflict, but also surprising periods of flourishing, seen internal dynamics playing out alongside external pressures, and noted the resilience of its people, its culture, including that complex, vital role of women.
It's a history where geography isn't just background, it's an active force, creating both isolation and connection.
Mm-hmm. External powers repeatedly exerting influence, often with really difficult consequences, while these distinct local identities and cultures somehow endured, evolved.
The modern history, Soviet invasion right through to the Taliban's recent return, it seems clearly rooted in these deep patterns. The strategic location, the internal complexities, the layering of external forces.
Absolutely. They all feed into it.
So here's a thought to leave you with, based on all this. Given Afghanistan's profound history, defined by this constant push and pull of external forces and that enduring internal identity, what does its past, as shown in these sources, suggest about the possibility of a future that's truly determined by Afghans themselves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe another way to think about it. How does the sheer contrast between Afghanistan's incredibly rich, ancient cultural heritage, that history of innovation, art, exchange, and the intense conflicts of recent decades, how does that challenge our usual ideas about what progress or stability even means for a nation?
Lots to think about. There are so many layers in this source material, and we really hope this deep dive gives you a solid foundation to keep exploring.